Welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation.
Good evening. My name is Paul Bracey, and I am the founder and president of the nonprofit Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation. Our goal is to assist in human reconciliation. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our Let's Talk event. The center focuses on creating a safe, healing learning environment for adults who want to eradicate racism and other forms of oppression in their communities. Our staff is made up of volunteers. With us this evening is our Chief Operating Officer, Randy Wilding, and one of our many volunteers, Joanne Zidek, who was responsible in putting this program together this evening for you. Tonight, the Let's Talk event is really part of our educational event for people in the Finding Your Voice program. However, we considered this to be such an important topic that we opened it up to the community. So this is a resource to you as well as the Doc C. Bracey Center is. If you look at our society today, there's a lot of issues facing us. Racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, women's rights, homophobia, gender identity, white supremacy. These issues really threaten our society. And the conversations around it sometimes are so difficult that people avoid the conversations. That is not helpful, that's not good. James and Laura's book is really timely for this. With all the dissension, anger, and violence in the world, this book is really important to us. And the book is also part of really working on human reconciliation. The co-authors of the book, Diversity Training That Generates Real Change, Inclusive Approaches That Benefits Individuals, Business, and Society, was published in July 2022 by Berrett-Koehler. The book was just named the top 10 list of best management books for 2022 in Canada in the leading newspaper, The Globe and Mail. This book is a valuable resource. It's a tool. It's easy to read and understand, like the authors, who are easy to connect with. Part of their presentation this evening will be a small group activity to bring aspects of the book to life. So let me formally introduce them now by reading the information on their book. Dr. James Rodgers is president and principal consultant of the Diversity Coach. He is recognized as a thought leader and leading strategist in the field of diversity management, providing high-end executive coaching, diversity, equity, and inclusion advice and counsel to senior executive teams. His clients include Johnson & Johnson, Prudential, IBM, Southern Company, Coca-Cola, and High Museum of Art. Dr. Rodgers is a fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants and the author of Managing Differently. Laura Kangas is a global diversity, equity, and inclusion organizational and management development consultant, workshop and program designer, facilitator and speaker, and writer. Also, I've had the pleasure to work with her over the years. Her clients include Texas Instruments, Partners Healthcare, Pfizer, Microsoft, Massachusetts General and Brigham's Hospital, Fidelity Investments, the Harvard T&H Chan School of Public Health, and many others. Her academic work includes a visiting professorship at the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics. I think you're going to find this an enjoyable evening. So join me in welcoming James and Laura to Let's Talk at the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. For those of you who don't know, the center is a dream come true for Paul, and he's such an amazing man, and he has great support staff with Randy and Joanne and a whole bunch of volunteers. And I think I can speak for Jim and myself when we say we're thrilled to be here to support the efforts of the center. So welcome, everyone. We're delighted to meet you. When I go to a workshop or a webinar, I wonder who are those people? So we're just gonna share a few personal thoughts about ourselves and tell you a little bit about why we felt we needed to write this book. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. So I'll start and then I'll pass it to Jim. So a little bit about me. I've been doing this work for over 30 years. I feel in some ways I was born into it. My grandparents were all immigrants, and my paternal grandmother was a workers' rights organizer in the 1920s, 30s, and she was fighting for three things around workers' rights: safety in the mills, child labor laws, and 12-hour workdays. And one day she was called in, she was head of the workers' committee. She spoke Finnish, but she also was good at languages, so she learned other ones. She was the head of the workers' committee, and one day they were all called in and she was told that she was fired. And her house was shot at, and there's a whole nother story in another book that goes with that. But let me just say that it's in my blood, it's in my soul around working for what I think is right. And why I have behind me, I live in Concord, Massachusetts. I was born in the town next over Acton, Massachusetts. And that's a picture of the Old North Bridge in Concord, Mass, where the American Revolution, you might have heard the shot heard around the world, was started. So Jim and I are trying to start a diversity, inclusion, fighting racism and other dimensions of diversity, and trying to get equity. And we are very clear that we want to start a revolution in that around the world. And I hear we have some people from overseas, so thank you so much for being here. First of all, I need you to know I never dreamed that I would be in corporate America, but I did spend a great deal of my career there and still do. And because one day I realized if we can change corporations and combine community work with corporate work, with academic work around these topics, we can really make a huge difference, but we've got to do it in a way that's meaningful. So that's part of where I'm coming from. And again, delighted to be here with you. Can't wait to see what I'm going to learn tonight. Jim?
Thank you, Laura. By way of introduction, my name is Dr. James Rodgers. I'm unusual in the field of diversity and inclusion in that I come at it from a enterprise performance standpoint. I believe when people do better, businesses do better. And in fact, we started this work inside corporations because it's intended for adults. And the one thing that we as adults all have in common is we all go to work somewhere. So we figured that if we could get the principles of diversity management installed inside organizations, people would then bring it home, take it to their faith communities, take it to their community, and we would all be better off. So just by way of introduction, I am an engineer by training. I spent 17 years as a corporate executive in the old telco industry. I am a business analyst. As Paul mentioned, I'm a fellow of the Institute of Management Consultant. So I believe in the consulting process as a problem-solving vehicle. Recently, I've become a scholar and a writer. The book we're talking about is my third published book, if you don't count my dissertation, which was also a book. I am considered and have been told by many of my colleagues as I'm the #1 thought leader in the field of diversity management and the leading strategist in the entire diversity and inclusion field. Former corporate executive, but I will also add that I am a spiritual teacher. Why am I telling you all this? Because the approach that you're going to be hearing from Laura and I draws from all of these disciplines. It is not a single discipline, but a multidisciplinary approach to the work that we're involved in. So we wanted to provide you with some context. The context of the writing of this book for me started when I began noticing how far off track the D&I industry had become. One of my colleagues who I have coached and mentored through 6 chief diversity officer jobs once told me, he says, Jim, it's turned into a diversity and inclusion industrial complex. In other words, people have taken the core principles and expanded it so much that it's created an entire industry. And the industry is made up largely of people who have not done their historical homework, and don't have an answer to the fundamental questions about why we do this work. So just to give you some background, I talked to over 300 D&I advocates before we finished this book, and I asked them one question: what do we need to do so that D&I is accessible and acceptable to everyone? The operative word is, if this doesn't work for everyone, it's not going to work for any of us. So they said one thing: we need to agree on something. We need a common language, a common principles, common purpose, common outcomes. If we can all agree on those things, we can begin to make progress. And so we adopted the theme, and you will hear this over and over tonight, D&I as a relationship discipline. And when I shared that with the diversity advocates, they all said, yeah, I can agree to that. I can support that. So that was kind of the foundation of the writing of this book, is to reframe diversity as not an emotion-laden thing that all of us are afraid to talk about, but something simple, human, and something that we can all get behind. So the research said that. So tonight, I want you to listen to what we're saying, and I expect that many of you all will have some issues with the way that we present it. My hope is that you will. You know, Mark Twain one time said, "We all do no end to feeling, and we mistake it for thinking." So I know you're going to have some feelings about it, but I would invite you to think with us about how we can begin to make serious progress on the road towards diversity management, inclusion, and all the isms that are attached to that discipline. So we want to share a couple of things about our approach as we get into our conversation about this discipline.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted to add that I've seen too much time wasted in people trying to get a movement moving. And so Jim and I talked a lot about what do people really need to know that's going to help them, whether they're doing the work in a community setting, an organizational setting, in a spiritual setting. And so that's what we set out to do, because we're already hundreds of years too late. So we wanted to share what we've learned from being in very intimate conversations with people, where you realize what helps people make a breakthrough. And the beauty of this work is, and I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody on this call tonight, on this webinar, that once people make a breakthrough around issues of racism, sexism, almost any dimension of diversity, you can't quite look at the world the same way. And then you begin to realize things begin to appear, and you get an awareness because you've made a connection from your own life and from listening to other people. And Jim's going to share some more thoughts about what we're going to talk about tonight that we think will be helpful to you in eradicating racism wherever you happen to be.
Yeah, so you can see the slide. This is all we got to offer you, just these three little points. Now, that's on purpose, because one of the things that I have learned from doing this work for 35 years, the more complex it gets, the less likely you're going to get support. One of the things that we know in OD work is excessive complexity means people are confused, and when the confused mind takes no action. We want people to take action. So what we're offering is a simple process. And it's anytime, and I've studied movements, how to get a movement moving. And I've studied even the work of Martin King and the civil rights movement. Why was it successful? And it was successful because of the simple fact that there was a clear why. And the why was not self-serving. It was not, I'm doing this so that I can free Black people. The why was, we say we are one thing in the Constitution. We say in our faith traditions we believe in one thing. I'm inviting us all to live up to that. That's why we're doing the work. And so begin with why. Simon Sinek told us in his writings that is the foundational principle of any movement taking root. Get everybody to understand why we're doing it in the first place. The second thing is, and Socrates said this, the beginning of any conversation, you have to define your terms. And of course, we have all fallen into this trap where we spend a half hour arguing back and forth with someone only to get to the end of the conversation and find out, oh, is that what you mean by diversity? That's not what I was talking about. So until we define our terms and get clear about what we're talking about, we're not likely to make progress in our conversation. And then Laura will talk at length about the foundation of our work is not specific dimensions of diversity, but our common humanity. It's about the human connection. One thing that we've discovered is all human beings have something in common. If I spend more than 10 minutes with another human being, I'm going to find something that I have in common with them. And guess what? Once I do that, the differences don't matter so much. So as we respond to your questions and as we present the fundamental principles of this book, these are the things that you're going to be coming back to every time. If you ask me a question, I'm going to say why. And I'm going to say, do you understand why you're doing it? So these are the fundamental foundational things that we're going to be focusing on. So I want to, while we're doing this, just define a couple of terms for you. And here's some things that we have done. Einstein said, until you can express it simply in a few words, then you don't understand it well enough. So we go out of our way to define these terms as simple as possible so that everybody can grasp them. I'm in the field of diversity management. That is my unique arena in this work. So I define diversity, that is the state of being diversity, is the collective mix of differences and similarities. I often like to turn that around to change the emphasis. It's the collective mix of similarities and, oh, by the way, differences. Because once we lead with similarities, we begin to make progress. Inclusion, by definition, is the act of creating a sense of belonging for all. Notice it has the word belonging in it. So that's one of the reasons I push back when people add B and those other letters to the designations. Inclusion is about a sense of belonging. Diversity management and the work that I do for major corporations is a strategy and a competence, a capability. It's a process that allows every employee to contribute fully to the organization's objectives. For tonight, I want to invite you to consider this definition of racism that I learned from the Reverend C.T. Vivian, a great civil rights leader who has a consulting firm. His son, Al Vivian, now continues to run Basic Diversity. But they do a program called a race and gender intensive to get people to look at those two issues and to educate themselves about the impact of their ignorance on those issues. And CT came up with the definition of racism that I think really works. He says, racism is making decisions with race as a major or the major factor. In other words, when you're in the decision-making process and you move, and your bias is one way versus the other, then you're engaging in racist behavior. What I like about it is he gave a good example of it. If you were out on a dark, rainy night, cold and dreary, along a stretch of road, and your car just conked out, and you are sitting between two houses. One of the things that they do in the workshop is get people, please be honest about your answer. You're not helping us or hurting us. This is for you to consider if you've ever engaged in racist behavior. So the question is, one of the houses has a mailbox that says Jamal Johnson. The other one has a mailbox that says Peter Kaczynski. Now, depending on whether you're black or white, which one of those are you going to go to first to get help? In the workshop, surprisingly, when people are honest, they give the answer that is most natural to them. If I'm black, I'm going to go see what Brother Jamal will do to help me. And if I'm white, sounds like an Eastern European name, so probably white. So I'm going to go there first. I just made a decision with race as a major factor, and that is the reason that I chose one versus the other. So with that simple definition, it allows us to take the emotion out of it. It allows us to level the playing field so that one group of people is not racist and another is not. You know, I'm a big fan of Broadway shows, and I remember years ago, 20 years ago, there was a Broadway show called Avenue Q, and one of the lead songs just made so much sense to me. The words of the song is, "We're all a little bit racist." And they make the point while they're singing the song, they give examples of even the most well-intentioned person will wind up making some decisions where race is a major factor. So those are the kind of the simple definitions that we operate with. We operate with simple principles, a simple purpose. We know what the outcome is. We know what we're driving towards. So we're not just doing stuff to be doing stuff. We have a goal in mind. We have a purpose for doing it. We have a set of principles we're operating against. And that is what drives the work that we're doing. Hope that makes sense to someone other than me. Any comments, Laura?
I just wanted to build on what you said, Jim, about that anyone can be a racist, that we need to stop being afraid to talk about race.
Yeah.
We need to have the courage to be the one that brings up the conversation. And as long as we're shying away from that, we're just going in circles. And
Yes.
one of the fundamental reasons about the why question is that if you're not sure, just stop, because intellectual conversation rarely, if ever, changes behavior.
Yeah.
We've been, as Jim likes to say, we've been talking about this in circles for way too many years.
Yeah. Laura hates it, but I'm a former tech geek. So I talk about this in terms of coding. In coding, we have something called a do loop. In other words, you start a set of instructions and tell the computer to do something. And then when it gets to one point, it just circles back and starts it all over again and over again. And that's what the conversation feels like. We've been talking about this for decades and decades and decades, and it doesn't feel like we're making any progress. I'm always reluctant to label someone as a racist because I know how heartfelt and bad that is. But I do invite people to consider that we're all subject to racist behavior. We're all subject to doing those things where we make decisions based on race, and we sometimes are not even aware that we're doing it. So I'm notorious for walking into a room of 200 people, and I ask them, how many people in here are racist? And of course, usually there's someone who gets it, and one or two people will raise their hand. And I say, okay, I can wait. And the rest of the room finally gets it. Based on what I know about and what you just told me about what racism really is, we're all a little bit racist. Now, what's the value of that? In the workshops that Laura and I do, we invite people to confront through experience their own bias, prejudice, stereotypes, and reactions to differences. We never tell them that that's a condition that you have. We just give them experiences where they discover it themselves. And that's much more powerful than anyone with any authority telling them, hey, guess what? You have bias. Guess what? You're prejudiced. Well, we all are. So what we try to do is get people to discover that and then to think about the implications of that and then decide, what am I going to do about this knowledge that I've just gained about myself? So this whole idea of putting labels on other people without accepting them ourselves is really part of the construct. Laura talks a lot about the meritocracy of pain, and we'll talk more about that. But I just wrote an article recently. It was called The Myth of Privilege. We throw so many things around in this conversation where we're attacking one group versus another and excluding ourselves, that I wanted to remind people that we all have privilege, especially those of us, and I know there are people from other countries, especially those of us who live in these United States. I happen to sit across in my faith community. I sit across from Andy Young, who's one of Dr. King's lieutenants. Most of what I've learned about how to deal with people on an equal level, I've learned from just listening to him, because his experience during those days taught him a lot about what works and what doesn't. And one of the things we know that doesn't work is telling people they're wrong, telling them you're not doing it right. And so we have to be very careful about that. So our whole process, once we get into the content of the book, is about inviting people to consider a new way of thinking for their own benefit. Remember, the subtitle of our book is Inclusive Approaches That Benefit Everyone. It benefits the individual, it benefits the businesses that I work with, and eventually it will benefit the entire society that we're living in. Okay, Laura, that's my sermon for the night. I'm going to let it go before.
Can we hear an amen?
Okay.
And building on what you said, Jim, I was wondering if you might share the story Andy Young tells about his neighbors down the street, the member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's better for him to tell it. But, Andy
Okay.
grew up in New Orleans. He and his brother, Walter, who's a good friend of mine, grew up in New Orleans. And they were just 5 houses from the Nazi headquarters
Oh, the Nazi.
in New Orleans. And he says, you know something? We were never afraid to go past that house. He said, somehow our father conditioned us that those are just people, and they're just, he calls them, they're just sick. And you don't denigrate sick people. You have compassion for them. You treat them like fellow human beings and say, whatever your ailment is, let me help you. But you don't fear them and you don't look down upon them. And that's one of the most powerful lessons he took into the civil rights movement. So even the people that were against what they were trying to do, he would always say, bless their heart. They're doing what they think is right. It feels sick on this side, but I am not going to judge them. And many, many times, people like John Lewis, when someone who had treated him badly came up to him and said, hey, I'm sorry, he embraced them immediately. He says, I know. And now we as brothers, let's move ahead together and solve this problem together. I hope that helps.
That was it. Thank you. And I know you said how Andy would really like to talk to those people. He would talk to them and find out. And that really goes into our next point about human connection. We have to learn how it feels on both sides of the conversation particularly around race. As Jim said earlier, people are going to resist if they don't see what's in it for them. And we are going to go in circles unless we really are courageous enough and we care enough to hear each other's point of view. And we give you many examples in the book with exercises to do that in your community work, in your organizational work, in your spiritual communities. And we really recommend that this notion of the meritocracy of pain is that it's in my opinion, Jim's I know as well, it's a total waste of time to waste time in shame and blame. And I would also say to waste too much time in intellectual conversation. You've got to get to the heart of the matter. People have to connect with whatever dimension of diversity that you are focused on at the moment. In this case, race, with the Doc C. Bracey is primarily right now working on racism, but I know they're working on everything. So you have to be able to engage in that conversation. We need to be honest with each other. We need to hear each other's pain, regardless of how that may look in our worldview, like what have you got to be worried about? Otherwise, we're not really having a human, authentic conversation. And authenticity is a key to success in this area. And I can't really stress that enough because people will get it. Remember, 80% of conversation is nonverbal. And if you're saying all the right words, but you're affect and isn't going along with it, people will know that. And I really want people to really think about doing their own work around letting go of shame or blame, because as Paul Bracey, our fearless leader in this work, has mentioned, I've done a lot of work with Paul, and he says a million phrases that I wish we could have included all of them in the book. This one we did is no one, when we walk into an organization, a group trying to do work around eradicating racism or any otherism, we make the point, and I've quoted Paul a million times, no one in this room created this. We were all born into this. And so now it's our job to try to understand each other and make it better. And this is an absolutely key point, because as long as we're stuck in yesterday and we're not creating a new tomorrow, I don't think there's any revolution that's going to start to really eradicate things. And as I said earlier, we're already too late. Did you want to add anything to that, Jim, around the
I do. That's one of my
Thank you.
favorite phrases,
I know.
not because Paul said it, but because we have experienced it in the classroom that it is so true. White men walk into a classroom that we're talking about with the feeling, I'm about to be shamed and blamed, and for something my great-grandfathers on my mother's side may have done. No one is looking at me as a human being, as an individual, and assessing what I bring to the party. And so that's why we're so deliberate about telling people there are no good guys, there are no bad guys. We're just a bunch of human beings trying to figure out how to work more effectively together. And so we try to level the playing field, take the natural feelings and emotional out of it, and let's explore this. Let's think our ways through it to figure out how we can collectively, working together, can figure out a way to move ahead of where we were 150 years ago. So, strictly from an American evolution standpoint, if we look at our history, we will see that there is a recurring theme. Everybody in this country eventually gets their shot. What we have to do is to work together so that we all see that all of us are necessary for us to maintain our position as the leader of the world. We have to work together to make that happen. And so this is why, if we let go of this idea of you're wrong and I'm right, let go of this idea of because of how you're packaged, I get to denigrate you. If we let go of that and engage everybody, you'll read in our book so many examples of where people, when they have opened up and said, here's my story, and when everybody will listen to their story, we get breakthrough, we get epiphany, we get catharsis, and those last for a lifetime. And so that's how we are encouraging you to think of this. We do this work one person at a time.
Jim, I want to build on what you said. You made me think of it, as you always do. One of my heroes is Nelson Mandela, who came out of prison after 25 years in prison. And I happened to be in South Africa when the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were doing their hearings. And when Nelson Mandela came out of jail, I don't know that anybody on the planet would have blamed the people in South Africa if they went into the revenge mode. But Nelson Mandela said, we are in this together and we are going to go ahead together. We are not going to get lost in the past. And we're going to go for it as a united South Africa. And they made an intention to, I mean, he could have said anything. He had so much power in his hands, but he said, we're all sisters and brothers, black, white, and of course in South Africa, they have a term called mixed, which is not a derogatory term at all. It's just a piece of data. And that goes back to Jim's words around terms, how important that is. So yeah, it's just, there's so much we can do. Okay, so anything else, Jim, before we kind of ask people to apply some of these concepts?
I wanted to go through the process in the book that we have. It's a step-by-step building block process it's important you understand that on whatever issue or whatever movement that you're trying to go, this comes direct. There's nothing new under the sun. So this comes directly out of my training as an OD consultant. It begins with understanding why. You're going to hear us beat that to death, because until you know why you're doing something, it's not likely you're going to make progress in tackling the problem or solving the issue. You got to know why you're doing it. Even on something like racism, we've gotten to the place where we just assume racism is a bad thing. Why? Why is it such a bad thing? If you look at one-on-one relationships with another human being, what are you working for? What is the outcome that you're looking for? And you can probably put some words to it, but until you go back to the core of it, look at it historically, look at it from the other person's point of view, you're not likely to make. We also find that as our organizations, the next step has to do with strategy. How does this tie to our organizational strategy? And I'm so glad that Laura was gracious enough to let me spend about three pages in the book defining that term, because most people use it and don't have a clue what it means. And so rather than just going through the whole process of saying, tie this to strategy, I took some time to say, and by the way, remember, this is what strategy is. It's all about positioning. And we go through the following steps. A lot of it, the book is about diversity training, but it's really, training is just one of the events, just one component of a diversity and inclusion initiative that we've done dozens and dozens of with large organizations. And they follow this same path. The ones that work follow this same path. Understanding who your audience is. We talk a lot in there about adult learning theory. And by the way, this has been around us for years. And this is what I'm talking about, multidisciplinary. We can pull from the disciplines that we already know. This has been around for years. We went back and say, here's the application of Malcolm Knowles' adult learning theory. And basically he says, you can give adults all the information in the world. Information is going to go in one ear and go out the other, until they decide there's something of value there, and they, not me, they convert that information into knowledge. That is, oh, you just said 100 words. There's 2 of those words I kind of like. I think I'm going to write those down. And then turning that knowledge into learning. And here's the key point. Learning must produce behavior change. Learning, by definition, produces behavior change. So you go from information to knowledge, knowledge to learning, and learning to behavior change. And when you set that out as your goal, that's how you can follow that path to really creating real change, as we talk about in the book. And we talk about models and we talk about follow-up. There is a process, a logical, practical process that you can follow in any movement on any issue that will get you from point A to point Z if you follow the discipline.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And one of the first steps in that is to really get in touch with ourselves around what does this mean in our life? This is part of the why, only a piece of the why, but it's important to be honest with yourself around this definition of race and to be able to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to break you into groups in a few minutes. And in the spirit of learning more about ourselves and others, we're asking you to talk about a time when you can recall being the recipient of racism or being the one making the decision based on race, as the story that Jim told. This is not any judgment. This is not about good or bad or anything. It's really about learning and listening. And the other thing is, you could also talk about when do you believe that somebody made a decision based on race about you? And what was the impact on you or the other person? So I'd be happy to share an example to get you started. And again, don't think too hard about this. You're not going to have that much time in the small groups, and we're going to come back and ask people to share what it was like to be in the small group and hear these stories, or what stuck out for you. But so just kind of think, it doesn't have to be a story that would be in the front of the Wall Street Journal It can just be something that happened that really raised your awareness. Again, if either you were the one who was using race or a factor, or you absolutely believe that someone was using the factor of your race against you. So a story I'd like to share is in the late 70s, early 80s, I had the privilege to be a facilitator at at the World Conference of the World Parliament of Religions. And there were 14 of us on the facilitation team, and we took over the Palmer Hotel in Chicago. And there was the Dalai Lama, there were the Wiccas, there were the nuns, there were the Buddhists, so you'd get on the elevator and you'd see the Native Americans with their headdresses, and it was just like living the United Nations for a week. And one of the speakers was Louis Farrakhan. And so I went to hear him speak, and the room was mobbed, it was packed. And so I got in late and I went and stood in the back. And so people were kind of pushing because people were trying to get in. And I got pushed into a young Black African-American woman. And she looked at me and she said, "Don't you ever touch me again," with such hate that honestly, it went right through my soul. And I thought to myself, she doesn't even know who I am. And I wasn't even trying to push her. I got pushed into her. But I really believe that it was because I was a white woman that she had this visceral reaction. And that was quite stunning, quite impactful. Now, I'm not judging her because I know in my lifetime, I am positive that I've made many decisions based on race, sometimes on an unconscious level, sometimes on a conscious level, similar to the stories that Jim told. So again, we just want you for each other's learning to the extent that you feel comfortable, and we're not recording the small groups. Just share your stories so you can get a chance to learn from each other.
So Laura,
and if you
can I offer
yes,
another way of looking at it? And part of your journey is how you respond to other people judging you or making decisions about you based on race. And Paul, you'll appreciate this. I like to tell the story of my grandfather, who was a commercial farmer in central Alabama in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, Papa was a good farmer. He was good. And so as a result of that, he had a lot of business partners, the people who would take his crops and convert them into products for the market. And he had a great relationship with them. So my sister tells the time that she was sitting in Papa's pickup truck, and he was meeting with two of the businessmen that he knew well, and they were just, shooting the breeze. And another gentleman walked up, and one of the guys he was talking to says, "Oh, hey, Paul, I want you to meet," my grandfather's name was Si. "I want you to meet Si. Si is a good N-word." And so Papa said nothing, got back in the truck, and my sister said, "Papa, why do you let that man talk to you like that and use that word with you?" And he said, "Girl, that don't mean nothing. Those are my business partners. They are just as constrained by this system as I am." And so he chose not to let that, what we consider that major slur, derail him from doing business with the people he needed to do business with. Now, I tell that because in the early days of my career, Lauren, I don't think I've ever told you this, but I was sitting with my supervisor in my first job as an equipment engineer. And I'm a pretty smart guy, so I was killing it. I was knocking the ball out of the park every week. I did more engineering estimates than most of the rest of the team combined. I was just knocking them out. And so Jake sat me down with him, and I tell people this and they just think that I'm crazy that I didn't respond to it. He sat me down and said, "I got to tell you, you really do good work for a colored boy." And this was in the 70s. And you know what I took from that? "Jim, you really do good work." I chose not to be triggered by his conditioning, because I know where he came from. And I know how people from that background, it's just normal language for them. So I chose not to be triggered by that so that it would get in the way of me achieving what I wanted to achieve. And of course, 2 years later, I was his boss. So, that shows you the advantage of having some context for all of these conversations, getting what you want out of it and not being triggered by things that don't really matter as much as what you're trying to accomplish. I just thought I'd throw that in, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to give you about 15 minutes. Is that right, Randy, in your small groups? Okay, and please, if you'd like, just introduce yourself by saying, I'm calling in from Chicago, or I'm calling in from Singapore, or whatever. And again, I wish you a good experience of learning from each other. Okay, so we're going to go in the small groups. You'll be asked to join a breakout room, and we will be back in 15 minutes. The questions are in the chat. Only share what you feel comfortable with, but don't think you have to find a grand story. And have a good talk. We'll be back. Have a chance to talk more. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We would love to get some comments from people so that we have an opportunity, get 1 or 2 comments due to the time. Unfortunately, we can't take more, but you could put some comments in the chat and Randy would be happy to share some of those, a couple of those with us. But we'd love to know, how was this for you, making that human connection and talking about race, whether you were on the receiving end or you recognized that you were using, as Jim said, the factor of race as a major factor in your decisions around your behavior or your judgment or whatever. So and Randy will identify people from the chat, because we can't see all of you who have identified as someone that wants to share.
Thank you all so much. I would love to call on Professor Lewis Thornton.
Welcome.
Vanya, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I have it on a separate monitor and I couldn't find the mouse to unmute.
Thank you.
One of the things that immediately came out was that somebody said, I'm only human. And that shaped all of our conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Because it helped to set the tone that mistakes are made. One of the things that became very apparent in people's stories was that sometimes when people were acting racist, or could be interpreted as acting racist, for example, locking the car door because you're in the wrong neighborhood, or what you perceive to be the wrong neighborhood, that they felt bad about that at a later point in time. That was something that they were uncomfortable with. So it was good conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take 1 or 2 more.
Now we're going to hear from Kathy Bracci.
Thank you. Hi, Kathy.
Okay, so I was in Vanya's group, but I would like to say it appeared that, we had a mix of people both experiencing, as the recipient of racist behavior, and then also people that may have engaged in some racist behavior, either intentionally or unintentionally. I don't know. I thank you, Vanya, for bringing up my "we're only human" comment. I appreciate that. But I think the whole tone there in our group was the smallest kind of incident resonated with us throughout our lives, because some of the things were, some of them were relatively minor, you would think. But the fact that people reacted so strongly and remember those incidents, shows how impactful those behaviors are to people.
Yeah, thank you. This is lifelong work. It's never over. And what we hope is that we can begin to get kind of like peeling an onion, you get deeper and deeper. And then sometime it's just going to hit you in the face like, wow, I've got so much more work to do. Thank you. One more, and then if we could hear some comments from the chat, so we'll have some time for questions. Randy.
Absolutely. Dr. Crosby.
Okay.
Just a second. Okay, let's go to Sam Baumgarten.
We were a little off task, but we got into discussing the workshop that we're actually going through tonight and some of the things that impressed us, and we appreciate the simplicity of the presentation that you're making and some of the key points. We also pointed out that people need to be ready in order to be influenced by diversity training. It's also important for us to just keep plugging away, keep at it. And I mentioned to the group a comment that I heard last night on MSNBC from one of the Little Rock 9 women, Brown, who said that, advocacy is a life sentence. So we're all in this for life, and we need to keep going at it. We also pointed out how childhood incidents are so critical, and how we raise children obviously has a permanent effect on what happens in the future. So we didn't speak to specific incidents as much about ourselves as sort of a general conversation about this advocacy work.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I'll be straight up honest with you. The motivation for me to do this work and write this book and continue to do this work till the day I die is for the souls of all children, to make a better world somehow for them to grow up in. So thank you for that. Jim, did you want to comment on any of those statements, or are you good?
Yeah, I was struck by Kathy's comment about I'm only human. One of the jokes that I make when I'm in the classroom, particularly around Laura's model of human behavior, is I tell people, okay, this is for all people who are human. If you're Dennis Rodman, this is not for you, but this is for all of us humans.
Now, wait a minute. Let's not stereotype.
No. It's a way of letting everybody know that we're all equal in this journey.
Yes.
That there are no good guys and bad guys. That if you are a human being, a part of the human species, you've got bias, prejudice, stereotypes, and reactions to differences. And a particular manifestations of that is of the various isms that we talk about. So yeah, we are only human, and these things show up out of our humanity. I was struck by that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Randy, did you want to share some comments from the chat?
Sure. This one's from Tom. Maybe we never say anything racist, but when we fail to respond to a racist comment with gentle correction, we are making everything worse. And another comment, and I think that anyone who is doing DEI work or social justice work can relate, from Deborah: the exhausting uphill nature of this work, even one by one, was shared by others, and that made me feel better somehow, that we're in good company.
Yeah.
And then we have a participant, Ross, who based on the comment, either was in a group with people from the US and Canada. The activity was great, being able to hear similar experiences and responses from across the US and Canada. We are all connected around these experiences. And that is a theme in some of the other comments that we received, is the connection, the common connection.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking just quickly at when you were all in your breakout rooms and we were together here. I was telling Paul and Randy and Joanne and Jim that when I did the Center's Eradicating Racism series, one of my greatest joys was to talk to people all over the world about their lives and what's gone on around this. And, there's people sitting in Iowa on their couch and in Minnesota and in, Italy and whatever. And it was just marvelous, that connection. And that really picks up on the fact that, as much as we care about this work and we want to do things, I'm going to really encourage you to enhance your leadership by having the courage to be authentic and to move towards intimacy around this work. And what I mean by that is, as we've done in the book, to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. And because that way, that then demonstrates our humanness. None of us is perfect. And it's just such a powerful connection when we can be honest. And I want to just share a quick story. Sometimes as a facilitator, a story comes to your mind, you say, I just need to say this tonight. I was doing work at a major corporation and the plant manager happens, a manufacturing company, and the plant manager was in our diversity workshop. And we did this exercise where we put lists around the room and people spoke out about everything they've ever heard or read about a certain group, like women or Black people, and whether they believed it or not, write it on the chart. And then we separated people into that group and they had to turn and look at each other. So one of the lists one day was Vietnam veterans. And people were invited to go stand by a list that they had a connection to. So the plant manager was the last one to go stand by a list. And he went to the Vietnam veteran list. And people in the room were stunned. And he said, this is a life-changing moment for me. And he said, I'm a Vietnam veteran. He's a white man. And he said, and I've never told anybody that because I know what the stereotypes are out there about Vietnam veterans. And I could hide it. And what I'm feeling at this moment is how many people can't hide their dimensions of diversity that they get judged on every single day. And from that moment on, he became one of the champions for work around eradicating racism in his community and the plant. And he motivated and encouraged and gave another manager the courage to say, I have a son who's developmentally disabled and I have such pain around that and I've never told anyone. And I too am realizing how we're all a part of this. And, Gordon Allport wrote in the book, The Nature of Prejudice, one of my best favorite books. The 25th anniversary edition came out recently and it wasn't that recently. And he said, prejudice is being down on what you're not up on. And that has sat with me, number one, around how I have to continue to learn. And secondly, what am I not up on? What am I holding some judgment around, or what don't I really even know about? So I need to have the courage to find out what I don't know and keep learning my entire life. So we would like to, and Jim, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just one. The comment that someone made about when we are in the presence of someone who is exhibiting racist behavior, I love the language that they have. Provide gentle correction. And what allows us to do that is to having the right context around what it is. We know that we're all capable of that. So when someone trips up and gets caught exhibiting that behavior, we don't have to get angry and scold them. We can gently say, hey, you might want to be aware of what you just said. You're making the decision with the race as a factor. And we know what that is, right? Because sometimes people just need things brought to their attention. They don't need to be scolded, judged, or coerced. They just need to have something gently brought to their attention. So I really, really appreciated that comment.
Yes. And I have to say, in this case, the people all huddled around the manager and he was crying, and people weren't about judgment. They were about supporting him and his honesty and his journey. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, again, the final statement here is even for well-intended people, that journey to intimacy around race can be a very difficult one, but essential. All right, so we are now ready to take some questions. We have some time. We have some information that Randy and Paul and Joanne want to share about the center at the end, but we do have some time for questions. So you can write them in the chat, because with this larger group, of course, it's hard for us to see the questions. So Randy, I'm going to let you facilitate this, and we'll do some answering. Jim will.
Yeah.
Give the tough ones to Jim.
Put it on me. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. So yes, as Laura said, please put your questions into the chat. We did have some for those of you that submitted the pre-event survey. Was an excellent opportunity to get questions to them, and they will also have those after the meeting as well. The first one tonight was, why do so many D&I or DEI efforts fail? What is missing in their approach?
I'm going to take that one, Laura, and then you can pipe in on it. Most of my work is with large organizations, agencies, government organizations, and large corporations. It wouldn't surprise you to know that the average tenure of a chief diversity officer is about 18 months, because they get hired to do something that has no definition, no purpose, no end game, and they're expected to produce something, and then no one ever tells them what the something is. So what they do is they stay for a while, they make a lot of money, and then they get frustrated and they leave. So the reason that the initiatives fail is because they don't do the things that we talked about. They don't know why they're doing it in the first place. They don't know what skills and competencies they need for a person to lead it. The most recent article that I wrote was who should lead a diversity initiative, not who you think. Because we put people in those jobs, and I was just reading an article by another professor who made the same comment. We put people in those jobs, and those are dead-end jobs. Because once you become a diversity person, it's extremely difficult for you to then move back into any other area of operations. So it's kind of a career-ending position. So the reason that it don't work is because the leaders, the CEO, the COO, don't take the time to understand the commercial value of this work. They think it's strictly a sociology project. They have not thought about the fact that if our people get along better, have better relationships, that will result in better productivity, more innovation, better decision-making, et cetera, which has impact on business outcomes. And since they don't make that translation, the people in the jobs running these initiatives don't bother to make the translation either. So that's been my experience of 35 years of looking at this. Some of my best friends have held those positions, and I tell them the same thing. Until you start understanding why, tie it to strategy, and come up with a practical, logical way of executing, this is going nowhere, but it'll look good.
Thank you, Jim. And I would add just a few other different points. Many organizations are saying they're doing diversity training, but they're really not. You know, people are required to do an hour of a video. A true story, a woman engineer came to me and said, oh, you do diversity work? Oh, my company's doing that. And I said, oh, that's great. Who are you working with? What are you doing? And she said, oh, well, we're all watching an hour video on it. It's required by the company. And I thought, well, there's going to be another disappointed, angry person, because there's not going to be change from that. And they think that the company is really invested in the work, and they're not. And as Jim often says, it can't be a standalone function in a company. It has to be interwoven into the fabric of the organization, the organization's a mission. So every time you put it as you position it as a standalone, you're in trouble. I mean, it should be a part of every business conversation? Are we looking at different perspectives? Has we considered the diversity of this? So that's one thing. The other is intellectual conversation is safe for most people. It's easy, but it doesn't create long-term change. And I think if any of us are sitting here, why are we here tonight? You probably had an experience that touched your soul, and you somewhere said, I want to be a part of this. I want to make a difference. And it wasn't, maybe it was because you read a book, but probably not, or had an hour conversation, but it's safe, or we go and watch shows, or, the company puts on a diversity fair, which is great for education. And I'm totally supportive of diversity education, or education around different dimensions of diversity. But let's not fool ourselves and think that's real training that's going to generate long-term change, because my belief is it never has and it never will.
Yeah, and I would just add, as we think about the context of this work, the training Laura is talking about, we do inside large, intact organizations. But when we talk about this being about enterprise performance, remember, the American society is an enterprise. These same principles that we're talking about that we apply in large corporations will apply to our larger society if we practice the same thing. Why are we addressing racism? Why do we call everything diversity and inclusion? Why are we working on this? What's the benefit for us as a nation to get this right? Once we get that down and we all agree to it and see what's in it for everybody, that it benefits everybody, then I think we start making progress.
Yeah, I actually want to jump on that with one last story, which is I was working with a community. I wasn't working with a community. A friend of mine was working with her community, very affluent, very white community. And so they said, oh, we're so excited. We're doing a 3-part series on racism. And so I looked at the design and I said, well, where is the part where people connect on a human level? And it's not like a college lecture. And then she said, oh, the people in this town aren't ready for that. And I said, do you really expect anything to change from this? And the person said, well, it's a start. It's a start. I said, well, honestly, I wouldn't get your expectations up, because people are going to have a great conversation intellectually, shut their computers off, go to bed, and have the exact same behavior tomorrow.
Yeah. And Laura, as you and I know, sometimes work like that does more harm than good.
That's true, because people who really understand the work, thank you, Jim, it's disappointing, and it just makes them angrier and more disenchanted and more resistant to even being part of the process. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Thank you all for your comments. Actually, the way that you answered that one question, you covered at least covered some of the topics that were in other pieces of the questions that have been posed. And for example, I'm a member of a mostly white women's organization. They want to be a more diverse organization. Do you have any suggestions on how we can go about it? So to your point, it's not the movie or college lecture. How would you go from there? What would be the change that you would suggest?
Well, again, I'm gonna be like a broken record. And I see my colleague Tim White is on the line, and we have always told people, don't look at the obvious clues about diversity. Any group of people, there is some diversity there. Diversity is both visible and non-visible. So if what they're talking about is increasing the visible diversity of the group, they have to define that. And then they have to say, why do we want visible diversity in this group? What is the benefit to this group of having that visible diversity? And let me just tell you from experience, if you don't do that, you may do a few little token things, go out and bring someone of color in or some female in, and guess what? 2 weeks later, they're gone because you haven't thought about why we want them there and what we're willing to do so that this is an inviting place for them to belong, and that we actually benefit from their presence in the group. So again, we get so caught up in being politically correct around the stuff that we don't take what I call the selfish attitude of making sure that this stuff will benefit me. If I get that visible diversity in here, it's a reminder to me of how broad perspectives are available to us that we're not taking advantage of, we're missing out on, we're not getting the innovation, the problem solving, all of those things, all of those advantages that come with diverse perspectives.
And building on your response, Jim, that was excellent. It reminds me of one of my favorite phrases that just came to me one day, which is, if you open your head and your heart to differences and to diversity, you'll get a richness and a wisdom into your life that by definition you couldn't get any other way. So I'd really like you to think about that. When you bring diversity, differences into your life, you get a wisdom and a richness that by definition you cannot get any other way.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jim. Another question: how do DEI professionals address resistance to DEI in the workplace?
Now they want to know how they do it or how they should do it. I'm going to try
Give
to
us how
address
they
all.
should.
Okay. Here's the thing. We say over and over again in this book, if everybody doesn't benefit, if everybody doesn't see value in this to them, no one group or no one person is going to benefit from this. So what we have done, the way that we have approached this work has created division, even without intending to create division. If you're focusing on one race, that means you're not focusing on the other races. That's divisive. If you're focusing exclusively on one gender and you're not mentioning the other gender, that's going to be divisive. So the way that I have seen that resistance comes up is that we talk so much about one thing and leave so many people out of the conversation that they naturally, as human beings, they respond in a natural human way. They resist. I wrote an article back in 1996 called What About Bob? Because I recognized that the way this movement was going, we were deliberately calling it inclusion and deliberately excluding a whole segment of our population. And that was non-Hispanic, heterosexual, able-bodied white men. In other words, everybody else is welcome at the table, but white men need not apply. And as a result of that, I said in that article, watch and see what happens. Eventually, as a cohort, they're going to resist this, and their resistance is going to matter. It's going to keep us from achieving what we're trying to do, simply because we were not wise enough to say, you are welcome into this conversation. You are a key part of it. None of us will get to the promised land unless all of us get there.
And just building on what you said, Jim, some people hear that as we're stepping away from the ugliness of isms and race. Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we're putting a spotlight on how race affects all of us so that we can do something meaningful and powerful, and everyone will understand why it's so important to do this.
Good.
Thank you. So we do have a couple questions about assessments and how do you assess the impact of your work? How do we know if DEI training produces change? How can organizations measure the success of their DEI efforts?
Okay, I'm going to start with this and remind you that my particular bent on this is enterprise performance. So I work at this from the standpoint of making AT&T a more effective enterprise, IBM a more effective enterprise, Accenture a more effective enterprise. And I tell people all the time, because I started my consulting career in total quality management. I followed it up with a lot of the other major initiatives and then was invited into the diversity conversation later on. And I try to approach diversity the same way I approach those other initiatives. What is the measure of success? Business performance, results, not rhetoric, not the ability to say cute little phrases, but to look at the bottom line and see, have my revenues gone up? Have my costs gone down? Real simple. We look at cycle times, the abilities of teams to communicate more effectively, to get better outcomes, to get better performance. And those are the same measures that business people look at to determine whether or not the business is on track. And I see no reason for this to be any different from that. Again, this is not a sociology project. This is a commercial value proposition. And if we treat it that way, we'll get more people on board and they'll be more serious about how they do the work and not allow it to be sidelined and marginalized like in most cases it is, which is why most diversity people inside organizations are frustrated and leave every 18 months.
Right. And I'd like to add to that from an HR point of view, because at one point I was an HR manager. And actually, what helps a lot of companies is to look at their turnover rates, to look at their why people are exiting the company, to see how difficult it is to recruit talent. Because what we know about any enterprise or even any town that wants to be attractive to people is that word gets around very quickly. And I, as an HR manager, had people turn down promotions in companies because the senior manager had a bad reputation around being supportive of, in some examples, women, and some examples, people of color, and some examples, many people didn't even have to be qualified, but if you were in the in-group, you got the job. And you know, that to me is a diversity issue. That's a race issue, either because you get privilege because of your race or you are automatically discounted because of it. Now, I live in New England. I will say that I'm a New England Patriots fan still, but we did have an offensive coordinator, for anybody that covers football, who had never done that job and walked into this position. And well, if anybody follows football, it was a disaster. And, you know, people just need to begin to get it, that this is unacceptable. And I love it when the economy gets tight, because then we can get people's attention for all the things that Jim's talking about. Sad that we can't do that proactively. And in communities start to think, why aren't we as attractive? Why aren't we rated as a great community? Well, word gets out there. And that's not just that people of color hear about potentially issues of racist behavior and things. White people care too. You know, many white people say, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be associated with that town, that organization. And of course, you know, some people are still not shopping at Walmart because they discriminated against older people. You know, I mean, so and that's a very hard thing to change. Those images stay in people's minds for a very long time.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have one that is, how do you recommend companies create employee resource groups? What is the most effective way to help senior leaders understand that people leaders under them may not be as bought into the DEI initiatives as they think?
I'll let you take that one, Jim.
That sounds like two questions. So I'm going to address the ERG, and then we'll talk about the lack of management support. I think that's what the second question is about, right? Randy, right?
Yes.
Okay. So ERGs have been around for a long time. Let me tell you, the real intent and purpose of them is to be a resource, as they says, to the organization. It recognizes that one group of people may have ideas that don't hit the big decision table, and we need those ideas. I can give you classic examples. PepsiCo had some ERGs. We're talking way back in the 90s, and they came up with some ideas of flavoring their chips. This was especially the Hispanic ERG. They came up with ideas of, hey, you know something, these chips are great, but I like the guacamole flavor. I like this flavor. they put those out and made an extra $100 million. So that's the value of an ERG. It's supposed to be a resource group. And again, when you start them, you have to ask the question, why are we doing this? Because it looks good, and wrong answer. It's because it's good for business. It's good for business. What we have seen is many, many examples of where ERGs have gotten invited to the table, who have come up with ideas that never would have been thought about, and have helped increase the value proposition of the businesses that they work in, simply because they bring a different perspective to the decision-making process. So I'm a big fan of them. I started one in Birmingham back in 1978, long before the diversity movement started, because I recognize we cannot afford to waste talent. And so if this talent needs to get together in order for them to be at their best, let's do that. On the second piece, one of the things that I've always done, I always start working with the senior team, and I tell them, you need to give everybody an opportunity to get on board with this. They should understand that part of their existence in this new culture is their support of diversity and inclusion. Give them a chance to understand it. Then if they resist, invite them to find a better way to make a living. It's quite that simple. If you're committed to this, my mentor used to say all the time, it's easy to be committed to diversity when you don't know what you're committing to. So if you're committed to it, you have to say, okay, we're going to educate you. We're going to tell you what the ground rules are. This is the new culture that we're operating in. We invite you to come along with us. And if you choose not to, you know, as we say down south, bless your heart. I hope everything works out for you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add, and for those of you in positions of power, when you attend an employee resource group that you don't necessarily identify with, that can be such a powerful message for people that you're coming to learn. So just want to really think about your behavior, that people are watching, people are looking, and even for community leaders to sincerely be interested in hearing what people from dimensions that you don't know about can be such a powerful message. But again, it's got to be authentic, not for the newspapers. I think we have time for one more, because I know Paul and Randy and Joanne have some things to say at the end.
Sure. Well, based on that, we've got one that's more forward thinking, one that's it's a little bit negative. Do you feel DEI professionals are on course for being squeezed out of organizations?
You get to start this time, Laura.
I was just going to say, only for the ones that don't want to be in business anymore and don't value the diversity, equity, inclusion, which in the year 2023, I think you're on a short rope in terms of being whatever your business has been successful in the past. As we know, tomorrow is never the same as today, and you can be ahead of the curve. You can be part of the future, or you can live in the past. And I think most people choose to be part of the future.
So I take a somewhat different tack to this, because as someone who has worked with people who have a responsibility for the health and welfare of the enterprise, one of the things that has been missing in the diversity space is a direct eye-to-eye connection between what they're doing and the health of the enterprise. So, and believe me, I wouldn't say this unless I knew for a fact that there is a connection at the team level. So I have seen it benefit organizations, but the heads of the organizations, the CEOs and COOs, have not educated themselves to learn the commercial value of diversity and inclusion. And therefore, they don't hold the Office of Diversity accountable for, that is, contributing to the health of the enterprise. They put them in that position, and it's almost like, and I hate to use this word, it's almost like a token position. It is like we have to have one because the outside world is looking. But what are they supposed to do? It is the responsibility of the leaders of the enterprise to define that for people. Here's your assignment. Here's what we hope that you will do. Here's what you bring to the party. And if they don't bring those things to the party, then they get, like I said earlier, they get marginalized. They get pushed to the side. They're not legitimate executive talent. They're not respected by the other members of the executive team. That's the outcome that you get. So I'm like Laura, I'm hoping that people will wake up, and the book is intended as a wake-up call for leaders of all enterprises to say, we got to get serious about this. Jim and Laura have given us a roadmap for how to do it right. If we follow this, now why do we believe that it's right? Because we've lived it for 25 years. We've done this work for 25 years. We have seen it work. It's not that we're guessing that this works. We have seen it work. And unfortunately, what we're doing today is so off track that we felt an obligation to share with the world, hey, folks, here's a way to do it so that you actually get benefit from it and that it generates real change.
And I just wanted to thank you, Jim. I wanted to add, when you said DEI professional, I didn't go to CDO, Chief Diversity Officer. I went to people who can advocate for the value of diversity. And my goal is that we do have DEI professionals go away because people have internalized that as human beings.
Yes.
So as I always say to my clients, I'm not here to be your guru. I want to be out of a job. I'm consulting to help transfer this technology, these skills. That's always my goal because life is too short. We have so much to do and you can do this. And I want to say to everybody on this call, never underestimate the power of the individual in this work. And anyone who's really had that opportunity to lead and be in those intimate conversations, individual power is unlimited in this work. And it might not happen the day that you are influencing the movement, but eventually it will. And one of my mentors said to me, Laura, one of your greatest challenges is going to be when somebody makes a baby step, when somebody makes a giant step, you're going to see it as a baby step. And you've got to let that go, that, we've got to build this day to day, and everyone can be a part of that. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, everybody can be a leader because everybody can be great because everybody can be of service. And I can't think of a better thing to work on.
Good.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to close with this invitation to all of those who chose to join us on this adventure tonight. Whatever you thought you understood about diversity and inclusion, be prepared to think again. Look at it with fresh eyes. Think about it from the standpoint of how do we make progress, how do we set a goal, and how do we achieve it? Otherwise, we will be continuing to have this conversation 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 60 years from now, and realize that we're not making progress. So I just invite you to think with us on how to do it in a way that really produces outcomes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's see. I would like to say thank you so much for our presenters, this book offers building blocks, facilitation tips, success stories, anecdotes, and not so successful stories that you can learn from. And I would also invite you all, as a measure to this event, we would love your feedback. We will be sending a post-event survey. And we would love for you all to join us. Laura mentioned the Eradicating Racism Learning Series. We will be starting that tomorrow evening. Paul and I will be working on that. And I would love for Laura and Jim, if you'd like to close us out with some final words, and then at the end, we will hear from Paul.
You're looking at me like you want me to go first, Laura. And you're on mute, by the way. I think I said what I really wanted to say. I have spent nearly 30 years of my life working on this. I didn't get into this work for it not to work. I'm pouring myself into it because I see the value, and I invite everyone else to step back, think with me. Let's work on solving the problem. It's not a problem, but let's work on solving this thing that we've made into a problem and making progress on it for the good of each of us as individuals, for the good of our enterprises, both business and governmental, and for the good of our society and for the good of the world. Laura and I were intent on starting a new global conversation about this work. And we have been delighted that across the world, people are resonating with this story. We have talked to people in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Switzerland, in UK, in Australia. All of them are resonating with this, with the message of this book. So help us to spread this message, folks. There is a way to do it. There's a way to do it that actually works. There's a way to do it that actually creates real change. With that, be blessed, everyone.
Thank you, Jim. And one of our esteemed colleagues, Tim White, reminded me of the how difficult organizational culture is to change. So keep that in mind. Do not get discouraged. We've come a long way. We have a tremendous way to go, but make that human connection. And as I said earlier, share who you are. When you share who you are and how you see things with other people, you share light and you bring some light to these issues. You don't lose anything, but the more light we have around these issues in the world, then the brighter we'll all be. And we're capable of that. And I really hope you join us in this movement. Paul, Randy, the Doxy Bracey Foundation, Joanne, everyone involved. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. And Jim, thank you for again blessing us with your eternal wisdom. And thank you so much. And thanks to all of you in advance for all the great work I know you're going to do.
I want to thank both James and Laura for sharing with us, being with us this evening. For the Finding Your Voice folks, there's going to be an added pleasure because they will be coming back in February for our Finding Your Voice learning session. We'll be able to talk more in detail with them and ask them perhaps more questions or pick up questions that they weren't able to answer during this period. Joanne, before I say anything else, is there anything you'd like to say? You're on mute.
Only that I'm so happy that so many people participated in this first Let's Talk event. And thank you all for participating from all different parts of the country and from various countries around the world. And a big thanks to Laura and James.
Thank you.
I would echo that. Thank everybody for coming. And for those of you that this is your first venture into learning about the Doxy Bracey Center, I'd encourage you to go to our website, see what's available. Everything that we do, the services we provide are free. Our intent is similar to what Laura and James are talking about. We're serious about making a change. We're serious about eradicating human oppression, though we don't expect to do it in our lifetime. I don't want to think that's the kind of setup. But what we do feel is that needs to be an ongoing presence, generation to generation, that has the same vision that helps us move forward. So like what James and Laura are talking about organizations understanding the connection between diversity and their performance, we need to understand that about the society. That if we want the kind of society that benefits our children and allows them to be the best they can be, we have to come together over all of these issues, not in a blame and shame way, but really in a hearing, understanding way. So if you're out there and you think you'd like to be involved, check us out. Go to our learning series. Again, they're free. We do accept donations because to present it is not free, but we want you to come and we don't want money to be an issue for you. Okay, and again, thank you all for coming. Thank James and Laura, not only for coming tonight, but for writing what they did right.
Oh, thank
This is
you.
an important work that you can use almost in any environment. So again, thank you all. I hope you come back in February because we're looking to see you. And I noticed there's some folks here from my community group, BCCR. There's some other volunteers here. And if I mention their names, then I'm afraid that I won't say everybody's name and somebody's going to be offended. But know that I see you. And I appreciate you coming. And I appreciate all of you being here. And stay safe. We've got serious issues in this country. Protect yourself. Come back. Thank you all.
Thank you.